Welcome everyone to the UHI Archaeology Institute monthly seminar. So this month we have invited Julia Håkansson. She's from University of Malmö in Sweden. And the research she's going to present to us now is the doctoral research that she's done. She's recently completed her PhD on this topic. History and Nationalism, an analysis of the Sweden Democrats and Danish People's Party's historical narratives. So I'm just going to hand over to you, Julia. Thank you very much for joining us from Malmö today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. And obviously, I wish I was with you in Orkney. I came to visit last spring and just wanted to get back ever since. So thank you very much. As Ragnhild said, I am a PhD candidate in history and history didactics here at Malmö University. And I'm going to talk to you today about my dissertation, the topic of my dissertation, with the somewhat dry title, History and Nationalism. But it's informative, at least. So I think I'm going to stick with it. The Sweden Democrats and the Danish People's Party are the two main right-wing populist parties in Sweden, respectively Denmark. And that's why I've chosen to study them. And also because they have sort of put their mark on Swedish and Danish politics during the last decades. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the parties, but the Sweden Democrats was founded in 1988 from a coalition of smaller parties with racist foundations, and the Danish People's Party was more of a elite project. It was founded out of succession of the established Progress Party. They are both right-wing populistic and nationalistic and conservative. The biggest difference today is that the Sweden Democrats has continuously gained a bigger electorate. So now they're at 20.5% in the national Swedish election, while the Danish People's Party has, or will soon probably disappear from Danish politics altogether. They're just above the line. They're just above 2% in Denmark. So, and I will show you a graph later of how much they have actually lost during the last few elections, and also talk a bit about why that is. So we have two parties that are, one is very strong, is now supporting party with the government, and the other party is vanishing. But 20 years ago, they had the position that the Sweden Democrats have now. So I think there is many interesting points of comparison just in this contextual bit. Their focus areas are less immigration and preservation of the national culture. They have other focus areas, but these two are the ones that have been consistent throughout the history of the parties, and also the ones that are most important for this presentation. So these two, are the ones that sort of unite the parties, and these are the differing factors. I have looked at some different sources. I've looked at the party magazines, the Danish, Dansk Folkeblad, the Danish People's Magazine, and the Sweden Democrats equivalent, and also some of their, or all of their party and principal programs and election manifests, because I think that this shows how the party wants to present themselves towards their members as well as potential voters. So it's a view of their historical culture, both from within and what they want to represent to the outside. And as you can see here, the Sweden Democrats have just skyrocketed during the last few years. They are now the second biggest party in Sweden and are currently the supporting party for the right-wing government. And you can see here that the Danish People's Party has been where the Sweden Democrats are today in 2015, but then declined quite heavily. And that is due to the fact that in 2001, they were the supporting party of a right-wing government, and they had that position for approximately 10 years. And then between 2011 and 2015, they were with the opposition. And in 2015, they were elected again. And when they then had the chance to actually be part of the government, not just be a supporting party, they chose to stay outside to be a supporting party. And that is probably why the voters then didn't vote for them in the next election in 2019. And there have also been other challengers from the far right. So they are slowly vanishing, it seems, from Danish politics if they do not change strategies. And culture and history and the Swedish or the Danish culture identity has been an important tool for them now that they are losing power, losing influence. And I will show some examples of this briefly. But as the title says, I'm doing a narrative analysis or an analysis of their narratives. And what that means is that I look at how they use history, how they tell stories of the nation's past, present, and future. And this is the most basic structure of a narrative analysis, that you look at the introduction, the complicating events, the climax of the story, and then how it orientates towards the present, and then with the subsequent moral of the story. And I view these narratives that I look at as a mosaic. I think there's one big picture that you get if you gather all of the history that is in this material, and you get one big story of how the Sweden Democrats present Swedish history, and you get one big narrative of how the Danish People's Party presents Danish history. But there are also these little pieces that you can look at individually. There are small narratives within the big narrative, and these can change. And when they change, it can change the entire picture, or it could just be something that just adjusts it a little bit. So there are narratives in the plural, is what I'm trying to say. And while I've mapped these narratives, I've found 4 major points of comparison that I've structured my dissertation around. And these are the myths of origin and the themes of conquests and losses, friends and enemies, and processes of democratization. And I will present these points of comparison one by one, so as to represent one chapter each. And I have looked at these narratives through the prism of nationalism. I try to see how they or how their nationalism color their interpretation of history. And it's quite evident that you can see that the core doctrine of nationalism colors how they view the nation's history. It shouldn't be surprising. Hobsbawm has said that historians are to nationalists as opium growers are to drug addicts. We provide the raw material, the addictive raw material. And this goes back to the 1800s when history became a profession. So history has long been in the service of nationalism. And it's not then strange that nationalisms go to history to try and create these narratives that can convince possible voters, members of the electorate, to actually vote for them. But the core doctrine is that the world is divided into nations, and each of these nations has its own character, its own history and destiny, and the nation is the sole source of political power. Loyalty to the nation overrides all other loyalties. To be free, every individual must belong to a nation, and every nation requires full self-expression and autonomy. Global peace and justice require a world of autonomous nations. And this core doctrine it's good to keep in mind while I continue my presentation. And this is, of course, from Anthony D. Smith and his work on nationalism. So the myth of origin corresponds to the introduction of the bigger narratives. And in these introducing of this Swedish history and the Danish history, both parties talk about three concepts: culture, nation, and the people. And these three entities are made into one, consisting of the national culture. It's sometimes difficult to separate the categories of, or the concepts of culture and nation and people from each other. And the parties often talk about them as one and the same, or at least that they are intrinsically bound to one another. So this is what unites these parties. This view of the national culture as something that the narrative revolves around. This is established in the introduction of the narratives. More concretely, the Danish People's Party has a clear starting point for their narratives that they find in history, with Harald Bluetooth and the Yelling Stone from the 900s, which is the in Danish historical culture, it's known as the baptism certificate of Denmark. It says that Harald Bluetooth christened and unified Denmark and Norway, basically. So they reproduce this myth, this origin myth of Denmark, when they talk about the beginning of the Danish nation. And the Danish People's Party does not discuss the origins of the Danish people and are not particularly interested in the soil on the Danish land. They don't talk about the Danish landscape as bound to a national character or something of the like. And that is due to the fact that they have lost territory in the past. They have lost the part I'm sitting in now, actually, Scania. They lost to Sweden in 1658, and they lost a part of southern Jutland as well. I will talk about this more when I come to the next chapter, but it explains why they cannot tie the national character to the actual land, to the soil. Instead, they talk about Danish culture as something that has decided the historical development of Denmark, and Danish values as an important part of the Danish culture. They lean more heavily towards these sorts of arguments. And that is also due to the fact that Denmark has had an outspoken cultural struggle, kulturkampen. I guess maybe you will call it culture wars, that started in 2001 approximately, where there was an outspoken political motive to find out what is Danish, what is Denmark, what is the Danish culture, what is Danish values, who are we, basically, in response to a heavy flow of immigration, or a perceived heavy flow of immigration into the country. And the Danish People's Party often claim that the people in the nation belong together over generations. There is an obligation to care for the heritage of previous generations, and also to hand something over to the next generation of Danes. And cultural heritage is portrayed as something valuable, something that needs to be sustained in order for the very nation to actually survive. If we then look at the Sweden Democrats instead, they talk more about the development of the Swedish culture as closely related to the Swedish climate. They go back to Montesquieu and even talk about his ideas from the 1700s and how the national character is bound to the cold winds and the cold winters, and it's impossible to take a siesta in Swedish culture because we are hardened by the climate. And you can also see some differences in how they talk about the origins of the Swedish people. So in the early 2000s, they talked a lot about the origins of the Swedish people. They went back thousands of years to talk about who the Swedish people were, where they came from, and the question of how the indigenous population that we have here in Sweden, the Samis, fit into this picture was also discussed. The most common argument was that there were two indigenous peoples or populations in Sweden, the Swedes and the Samis. Then after 2009, approximately, that discussion was just no more. They just let go of that discussion, probably because it became too complicated to talk about. And also maybe because of the racial biological tendencies that you could see in the beginning of the 90s in the party magazine. It might be that discussing who the Swedish people were and where they came from was considered to be too provocative. They claim, as the Danish People's Party do, that the Swedish culture has been cultivated over time, and also that the people in the nation belong together over generations, and that it's important to sustain the culture and the cultural heritage in order for an internal cohesion in Sweden to survive. And that internal cohesion is what constitutes a safe welfare society. So there are some differences, but also some similarities. And this chapter, this point of comparison, myths of origin, is the hardest one to explain because the concepts go into one and another to such a high degree. So if you have any questions about this later on, I'm sure we can. I can clarify if I wasn't being clear. Here you can see the yelling stone reproduced at one, or a reproduction of the yelling stone at one of the elections manifestos. And it simply says, "Your land, your choice, vote Danish," which is their election campaign. And then just this rune stone on top, or on the front. And I think this signals something, just that the stone is able to be there without any context being given. The recipients is supposed to know the symbolism of what this yelling stone is meant to represent. And in regards to the national culture, the Sweden Democrats and the Danish People's Party represent themselves as necessary guardians to this national culture. They are the ones pointing out a problem in the present, and therefore the one who can provide the solution to this problem. And the electorates are then given the choice. They can decide how the future is going to be. Either they give the power to the Sweden Democrats and the Danish People's Party, and they will restore the national culture, or the country will deteriorate into a multicultural society. this is, I will develop more on this in the fourth point of comparison, the processes of democratization. But the big issue that they present in the narratives is that a historical continuity has been broken and that the national culture is threatened by foreign invading cultures. And that is also why these myths of origins are important. They show long, glorious lines of the nation way back in the present, or in the past, that creates this long continuity that is in itself then presented as being worth something, and that is broken by this new multiculturalism. And the second chapter, or the second point of comparison, is conquests and losses. And this is quite common topic in nationalism, especially maybe the concept of loss or defeat. Actually, defeat nationalism is a concept that describes how a small country such as Denmark can create a strong nationalistic sense by talking about defeats and losses in the past, such as the Scanian landscapes in the 17th century and parts of southern Jutland in 1864. These national traumas create a strong sense of cohesion within the remaining group. And this is very evident in the case of the Danish People's Party, that they base their nationalism on this sense of defeat. It is a clear case of defeat nationalism. And it has also to do with the fact that they were occupied but during the Second World War. They were occupied by Germany. And that has also strengthened the role of them as victims, but also a nation that overcomes obstacles and can handle these big losses. The Sweden Democrats have another, how do you say, because Sweden has another history, they have different material to use in this category, and they talk more about Sweden as a great power in the 17th and 18th centuries, and not so much about losses at all. And this is done mainly in the 90s, when they talk much about heroes of old kings from these centuries, and talk about Sweden as the good old days, the glorious days of Sweden as a great power. And they also talk about the Finnish Winter War. Since Sweden wasn't in the war, we weren't occupied by Germany, but sent soldiers to the Finnish Winter War. The Sweden Democrats talk about the Finnish Winter War as something that could be similar to how the Danish People's Party used defeat nationalism. They also actually borrow Norwegian and Danish members of the resistance movements. You can see in the Danish People's Party magazine how they let old members of the resistance movement come forward and talk about how it was then in Denmark when they were occupied by a foreign force, and how Muslims are now constituting just as big a threat to Denmark today. And this is picked up by the Sweden Democrats, who then borrows Norwegian and Danish members of these resistance movements. So this is an interesting one of these interesting points where you can see that they influence each other, or that one influences the other, and that the Sweden Democrats don't have, because of Swedish history, they do not have these losses that they can make a point out of, such as the Danish People's Party has. So it says something about the mechanisms of nationalism as well. Within this category, you can observe some partial and complete silences. I have divided these into two categories because the partial silences are something that is mentioned briefly, or where they deflect from the topic, such as when the Danish People's Party talk about Denmark's colonial past. They deflect by talking about Arabic slave trade and how that was even worse, or that it is still ongoing today, and that people should talk about that instead of Denmark's colonial past, because that is in the past. And also that the slaves were better treated by Danes than by others. Sort of strategies to deflect from the actual topic. Whereas you can see with the Sweden Democrats, you can see a partial silence of the loss of Finland. Finland was a part of Sweden until 1809, but when Sweden, the two countries were separated, the Sweden Democrats hasn't talked about that as a defeat. They have talked about it some, but they also say that it wasn't the big catastrophe that it could have been, and that is due to the nationalist, the core doctrine that a nation should be sovereign. So the loss of Finland was the loss of a sovereign nation and cannot be mourned in the same way that, for instance, the Danish People's Party mourn the Scanian landscapes, because the Scanian landscapes were a part of the nation Denmark. And the Sweden Democrats don't talk about the emigration to North America, where approximately 1 million people emigrated because of the poor conditions in Sweden. This is an almost complete silence. And this is, of course, a historic loss of sorts. The Danish People's Party has a complicated relationship to Greenland and the Faroe Islands that is a part of Denmark, or are a part of Denmark, but according to the core doctrine would constitute their own nations. So you can see that they are conflicted about how they talk about these two parts of the Kingdom of Denmark. In the category of friends and enemies, which is the third point of comparison, you can see some similarities in that they both use the Vikings as national symbols, but in slightly different ways. The Danish People's Party used the Vikings as a foundation myth, or a myth of origin, while the Sweden Democrats use the Vikings as well as monarchs and old freedom fighters as inspiration for an ongoing struggle. There are national heroes that are supposed to inspire to continue a political struggle towards threats to the nation today. And these are mainly there in the material during the 1980s and 1990s. And then after the year of 2000, they basically disappear. And this is to do with a shift in their strategy and how they use history, which I will talk a bit more about later. But they also talk about culturally influential men during the 19th century. Both parties do this. This is, of course, because this was the century of national romanticism. There are a lot of these men to choose from who wrote about what it was like to be Swedish, what it was like to be Danish, and what constituted the country and the national identity. And they used this as inspiration as well. Monarchs are not used as much by the Danish People's Party because they had such poor monarchs that couldn't support the country, or that couldn't not support but keep the country together. They lost the Scandinavian landscapes, for an example, and have generally been left outside of the history writing. They do tend to use other freedom fighters, more coming from the people, which is an obvious populistic tendency to talk about the people as the ones who really protect the country when it's needed. So they have a lot of these examples of soldiers from different wars. And also some politicians, which I think is, yeah, it's difficult if you're not Swedish to know who these people are, but people that they look up to from the past. This is more with the Sweden Democrats than the Danish People's Party. With it, how they construct the images of enemies, there you can clearly see similarities. This is probably the most similar the two parties are in all of the history writing that I'm looking at. They both claim that the elite in the countries, consisting of the politicians, that is, politicians of all the other parties except from the Sweden Democrats and the Danish People's Party, and the media, has run a multicultural agenda to create multicultural societies in Sweden and Denmark. And the Sweden Democrats call themselves the People's Movement. They don't really refer to themselves, or would rather refer to themselves as a people's movement than a political party. And that this is uprising against the power. And these primary enemies have then opened the doors to the secondary immigrants, the secondary enemies, who are the immigrants that has been allowed into the countries, and then particularly Muslims, who constitute a threat to the national culture. And we find the processes of democratization beginning in the 1800s for the Sweden Democrats. It begins with social conservatives' ideas during the 19th century, and with the Danish People's Party, it is with the signing of the Constitution in 1849. So these processes of democratization that then leads to the secure welfare state, which in the Swedish case is called the people's home, which is a metaphor then for the social democratic vision of an equal society. And in the Danish case, it's described as a society based on the ideas of freedom and democracy, which then the enemies of the nation and the national culture is presented as also being enemies towards freedom and democracy. Within these narratives of the processes of democratization, there also exists the big break in continuity. This is where the history, or the grand narrative, so to say, has its climax, where the ideal golden age, the ideal society is broken off. And with the Sweden Democrats, it's the immigration that took place in the 1970s. And in the Danish People's Party's case, it's the Aliens Act that was introduced in 1983. So these are points that they always come back to. This is where the society started to deteriorate. And we are now left in the situation that what has been lost must be rebuilt, and what remains of the ideal society and then the national culture must be protected. And the only ones who could do that is, in fact, the Sweden Democrats and the Danish People's Party. And speaking more broadly, you can see that changes over time in these narratives. The Sweden Democrats move from focusing more on national heroes towards being more concerned with bringing forward extinct customs and traditions as a conscious strategy, while the Danish People's Party are generally more consistent in their use of history. And the most prominent change is that they, in fact, write themselves into the narrative. Since they were a big part of Danish politics during the period between 2001 and 2019, or 2019, they can point to changes that they have made in Danish politics that has then led to less immigration. The Sweden Democrats have been kept outside of government until 2022, so they cannot really show that they have done anything yet. So they cannot bring themselves into the narrative otherwise than as a promise or an opportunity to fix things. And as I said, the shift in strategies can be observed through this quote by Jimmie Åkesson, who is the party leader of the Sweden Democrats. He says that Swedish culture has never been so exposed as it is today through mass immigration and globalization. What we need is not more people who shamefully question the existence of the Swedish language. Instead, we need to spread light over both the living and the extinct customs and practices. We need to breathe new life into our traditions. We need to strengthen and guard Swedish fundamental norms and values. This is a prerequisite for us to be able to maintain and develop our stability and well-being. So this is what you can find if you look closely in their party magazine, how they talk about these narrative strategies or strategies on how to use history. And this is how it is made. They bring out these old traditions and old archaeological finds. The one to the left, yes, it's your left as well, is a Nordic chess called Knäffatafel. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not sure. But that is a sort of a Nordic chess game played by the Vikings, and which then the readers of the Sweden Democrats magazine is instructed on how to play. And there are also these archaeological articles. This is from the Trojaborgar, which stone labyrinths found in the Swedish landscape that could have been there for thousands of years, and we don't really know what they were used for. And you can see a lot of these articles in the Sweden Democrats magazine to raise awareness of, as they say, extinct customs and traditions. The Danish People's Party has another strategy that is also interesting. They have created their own history education for their members. So they drive around with the history bus, as they call it. The headline here says the history bus a success, and there are pictures from when their members have gone with the history bus to different locations with importance for Danish history. And they often talk about knowledge of history in this context while they inform about their educational program for their members in Danish history as a political tool, or as a potential political tool, that they should know where they come from, and they should know how to use this in Danish politics, or in their work as a politician representing the Danish People's Party. And you can also see here how this sense of a broken continuity is always present. And in the Danish People's Party's magazine, it's also used while tracing the roots of the Danish nation. So it's not always that these narratives that these narratives are represented in their entirety. They can come in snippets, they can come in small pieces, or they can come in parts of the narratives that when you have the full picture, you understand it. But they say that large buildings such as the Dannevirkevolden indicate that there was already an important central power in the 17th century. As far as immigration is concerned, it has been very limited after the first Bronze Age settlements. No more than 20,000 foreigners have settled here until the large mass immigration was artificially provoked 30 years ago. So history is everywhere within their strategies or within their talking politics. History is always there as a tool to be used. And their view on culture is that it mostly consists of cultural heritage. It is mostly to preserve something that is already there. And today's living members of the nation are put into the position of caretakers more than inventors of new traditions or new cultural expressions. The most important thing is to keep something that has already been defined alive. The role as caretaker or preserving a heritage to future generations. And culture that challenges the position of the national culture is considered to be a threat to the nation, and this has been expressed explicitly by both parties, especially in the cultural struggle or the cultural wars, where the Sweden Democrats are now wanting to bring about a cultural canon in Sweden, where, well, basically a list of cultural artifacts and things that are most important for representation of the Swedish nation, such as Denmark had made in 2005. And both of these parties have been involved in the cultural struggles in different ways. The Danish People's Party more rode along with other right-wing parties, and the Sweden Democrats are driving the cultural struggle, or the driving factor behind the cultural struggle in Sweden today. So they have now just the other week wanted to forbid burning of the Swedish flag. And yes, you might know we have had some controversies here in Sweden with the burnings of the Koran. And the Sweden Democrats then claim that it should be legal to burn everything except the Swedish flag, because the Swedish flag is outside of politics. It is something that is at its core Swedish and unites all Swedes. So it should be illegal. But the Quran is as a religious document that should be able to be burned or blasphemed. There are no laws against blasphemous acts in Sweden, but the Sweden Democrats want to protect the Swedish flag above all of this. So this also proves that the Sweden Democrats don't really consider what they are doing politics. Since they are representing the people, what they suggest are actually more ideas of common sense. And I think it's important to keep that in mind while talking about these parties, that since they claim to speak for the people, they don't really, they see the multicultural societies as politics, and what they represent are something else. It's the truth. And yeah, I'll stop there. I hope I didn't go over time.
That was perfect, Julia. That was really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And oh wow, I've got lots of questions coming up in my head now, but I see there's a question in the chat already, so I wanted to just do that first. Here, let me bring up the chat. Oh yes, this one is a question from Michael Pereira, who asks, are the ideas of these parties rooted in governance theory, so that Gobino theory, the inequality of human races, where we argue that there are intellectual differences between human races, that civilizations decline and fall when the races are mixed, and that the white race is superior? National Socialist Germany developed these ideas and used it as a fundamental principle, i.e. the sole validity of the Nordic race. Yes, that's something that you didn't really discuss so much, is about race in the middle of all this. You talk more about religion and culture.
Yeah, they don't. Well, the Sweden Democrats in the early ages, between 1988 and 1995 approximately, do talk about race. And they talk about the differences between races, and that they don't really say that one race is better than the other, but they do talk about differences and varieties between races. But that vanishes after 1995, and the Danish People's Party do not speak about races at all.
That's really interesting. Is it because it becomes impossible to talk about for some reason?
I think, I think when the Sweden Democrats decide that they want to become more of a mainstream party, they realize that they cannot talk about race anymore, because that is what ties them to other racist foundations or racist parties at the time. So they want to step away from that context, and that's why they talk more about they talk about culture all the time, but the race arguments vanish.
Michael follows this up with, is immigration now used as a proxy for race?
Well, that could be an interpretation. I cannot say that it is so for certain. But you could see you could see sort of that the arguments of immigration as a threat, along with talks of differences between races, are there in the beginning of the 1990s, and that one of them vanishes afterwards, or after a while. So I cannot say that it is used as a proxy, but you can see that one of them stays while the other one goes.
Wow. And I wanted to ask, I wanted to come back to the quote you had early on about historians and archaeologists being like the opium growers.
Yeah.
Because that really highlights the big ethical responsibility. And speaking here from an archaeology department, so I think a lot of what we do here is often thought of as kind of neutral. If we excavate the Dannevirke, or if we excavate and find a central place, for example, and we write about that, and this is where governance was led from, and so on. That is kind of viewed as neutral in archaeological reports, but what you're showing is that there is a big ethical responsibility here.
Yeah, I think so. I think there is a big ethical responsibility to question these narratives, and to question especially national narratives, nationalist narratives that we have contributed to creating in the 1800s mainly, but also that sort of just survives. They just thrive. We often make claims based on national borders and national interest, and that's, for an example, it is why Scania is so badly excavated, because it's not really considered Swedish or Danish as well. So it's not really a part of anyone's national history.
Right, so the research agendas have followed the interest has lain in establishing a national identity.
Yeah. I think until the end of the Second World War, when the consequences of nationalism, or the potential horrifying consequences of nationalism, became known, historians moved away from this more consciously. But I still think it's you can still see a lot of most books being published is like Swedish history or Danish history, and it's adapted for a market because it's the narratives we have sold people for so long. We continue to sell them.
Do you see any time lag in the sense that, because I often experience myself that what people know about archaeology is quite old knowledge, or they're still in the narratives that were perhaps in the early 1900s sometimes, or that old archaeological narratives are still alive out there in popular culture. And it takes a while for new interpretations and new narratives coming from archaeologists themselves to kind of filter out into people. Do you see that kind of time lag in the political texts you've studied?
Well, you can see it with, I'm not sure, well, the Viking Age, definitely. Like there is a very sort of national myth there that is hard to bust. I think that has more to do also with popular culture, maybe. But I think when these narratives have set, I think it's very hard to contradict them. I think, for an example, it's not an archaeological example, but in Denmark with the occupation under Germany during the Second World War, there is such a strong narrative of resistance that even members of the resistance movement that want to tell a different story of collaboration, for an example, are refused to do that because the public has already accepted one narrative and they don't want to accept a new narrative. So I think we need to be, we as researchers within the humanities, both historians and archaeologists, we need to be aware of the functions of narratives and that people understand history and time through a narrative lens, and to be able to challenge what they already know, we must be very convincing, I think.
And here's another question here from Moral, who says, "Thank you, Julia. Very interesting presentation. Can I just make a comment, not a question? In the UK, there's Scottish nationalism and English nationalism, and most would agree that these are very different kinds of nationalism. It would be useful to apply your analytical comparative approach to these nationalisms too."
Definitely. I think this, definitely. I'm sure you can find, and also maybe some counter narratives between these two. I'm almost sure there would be counter narratives where these two collide and talk about the same historical events but from different perspectives. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, that would be a really interesting project. That could be a good collaborative project between yourself and somebody from a British university.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
I see strong echoes of what you've been saying in British politics as well. Some of these narratives, I see Christopher nodding here, yeah. Christopher saying it's not just British, it's in all countries, Americans and so on, yeah.
Exactly, it's basically everywhere. These parties are springing up in various different national contexts, and also they also collaborate, and these they tend to use the same sort of myths and the same if we speak about, for instance, how they portray enemies of the nation, they often use the same tropes. So they often these populist nationalist parties would talk about Islam as a medieval religion, for an example. But then also in the Swedish and Danish case, talk about the Viking Age as something glorious and the bedrock of modernity and of democracy. So there are these dual visions of, or these dual depictions of medieval times that is consequently used by many of these parties.
Yeah, and I think to pick up on that is that you showed the Harald Bluetooth rune stone and the foundation legend for Denmark. And on that rune stone, it says that it's for that Harald who conquered, who was king of all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. So he is presenting himself as somebody who's brought a new religion into Denmark. And he's thereby changed the whole culture fundamentally by changing the religion. So in a way, he's more similar to Muslims today who are bringing in a new religion to Denmark. But that's not something that's picked up on here. Harald Bluetooth is presented as a Viking, but he's a Christian Viking. He's specifically a Christian Viking. So Christianity is like brought in as part of this cultural heritage, even though it was new at the point when Harald Bluetooth was king of Denmark.
Exactly.
It's not rational, says Christian.
No, but it's the downplaying of conflicts when it's convenient, I think, because the shifting between two religions is, as we know, today, it wasn't always as peaceful as it has been depicted, or as voluntarily as it has been depicted, the shift from Old Norse religion to Christianity. And he is, in fact, as you point out, he is also the elite saying, now you are Christians. So he is, in fact, behaving in the same way as they claim that the elite are doing today. Yeah. It's true. I haven't thought about that. Because Christianity is also so important for these parties. That's why they downplay that conflict or the shifting of religions, because Christianity is to them an integral part of national culture, and also a defense against Islam.
We got a question here in the chat from George, and I need to scroll up to see the start of it. Oh yes, in Scotland there does seem to be two types of nationalism: an ethnic one, which is quite exclusive and tends towards reaction, and a civic nationalism that says everyone who lives in the country should be considered Scottish. If we are to have a sense of nation, we do need to accept we are different peoples who have come together. In a way that reflects our history with the divisions between the Highlands and the Lowlands and the Gaelic traditions, Picts, English speakers, but more in common with Northumbria, plus the Nordic traditions. Yeah, good point, George, that Scotland is a big melting pot of different groups of people, and so are all countries really. But the point about the two types of Scottish nationalism is the Scottish National Party have promoted this civic nationalism that they want independence, but everyone who lives in Scotland is part of Scotland and the Scottish people. But then there's also this other type that plays more to this Scotland as a nation with their heroes like William Wallace and their millennial culture.
Yeah, I think that's an important, is what is within nationalism studies also sometimes referred to as objective and subjective nationalism. And I think the civic nationalism is the equivalent then to the civic and objective are equivalent. I think it's with, if you accept the language, if you speak the language, and if you accept the customs, while the subjective or the ethnic are more, it's something you inherit, it's in your blood, it's in your essence basically. And these parties, or the Sweden Democrats, claim that you can choose to become Swedish, but then sometimes they talk about Swedishness as something that is inherited and that is something that is transferred throughout generations. So I think they want to present themselves as being open, or representing an open Swedishness, a civic Swedishness that you can choose, but then they're not really consistent in that sense. So I think it's important to distinguish between these types of nationalism and what they really mean when they say it.
Yeah. Can I go back to what you said about Denmark, Sweden, and Norway? And because I think seen from Britain, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway look like one block. They're just all called Scandinavia, and sometimes even Finland is included in that block. Whereas historically, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden have been bitter enemies and have had wars between them. So it's only like in the last 100 years or so that they've been close friends. So I was wondering how the Danish and Swedish parties, do they include the Scandinavian countries as one kind of super nation, or do they still see each other as potential enemies since they're drawing so much on early modern history?
No, they definitely see themselves as a unity. They talk about their identities as national first, Nordic second, European after that, and then Western. Yeah, so it's like a falling grade, and the Nordic is very strong within these parties, and there's a historical animosity between Sweden and Denmark that the Danes sometimes talk about, but they also say that we're friends now and we're bound together in this Nordic unity, and Norway as well. And they don't really talk about. There's also some sort of partial silence as to the fact that Sweden and Denmark has argued over Norway in the past. So who's supposed to own Norway and fought wars of that and stuff, but they don't really problematize that. So it's one of those partial silences, but they definitely talk about Nordic and the Nordic identity, and that they want to strengthen Nordic cooperations because the Nordic region should be a power player, like on a global scale. So more Nordic, less European, or not less European, but less EU.
All right. Okay. So there's an opposition to the EU in all this as well.
Yeah. They are opposed to EU and claim that it's also, we can again go back to the core doctrine of nationalism, because they claim that the EU is challenging the sovereignty of the Swedish and the Danish nations.
Because otherwise, parties on the political right are often in favor of free trade.
Yeah. They are, in their own words, pragmatic in that sense. So they are economically sometimes liberal and sometimes conservative. It's not consistent always. But they are for free trade, but not like with the EU, that they claim to be a new super state.
There's anxiety about taking sovereignty away from the nation state, which we see in British politics as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Michael wants to come back to this ethical responsibility. He says, are there any academic historians or archaeologists or anthropologists being used by these parties to present their view of history to make it more respectable?
Sometimes there actually is, and it's interesting because they sometimes very clearly target specific historians that research them. As during the 90s, there was a woman called Helene Lööw who researched the Sweden Democrats, and then when she claimed that the Sweden Democrats, or in her research, she claimed that they are no longer a racist party. Then they started quoting her all the time. And to say, as Helene Lööw says, we are not a racist party. So they are quite opportunistic in that sense. And sometimes they also quote historians when they talk about the monarchy, for instance. Yeah, so when it's suitable, they do. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they often review, or not often, but sometimes review historical works and, yeah, archaeology as well, and language studies. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it would be interesting to study what the curriculum of the history bus actually consists of.
Yeah, definitely.
There's no more questions in the chat that I can see here. I'll just check if I've scrolled far enough down.
I think there's is one
there's
from
yeah, from mine. In Scotland, a term that's often used to refer to people who are from elsewhere and have chosen to live here are New Scots. It's a respectful term, and that New Scots themselves usually like, in my experience. You see this as a deliberate way of influencing national culture. Does it occur in other countries? For example, New Swedes or New Danes?
Regarding the first question, it depends on how it is depicted. If it's talk about like New Scots in the sense that they have adapted to it, or if they have integrated or assimilated, I think that's the difference. If they had adapted to the Scottish culture, or if they had brought parts of their own culture within. Occasions by choice. Yeah, I think that they do talk about new Swedes and new Danes. I don't think that these parties don't. They sometimes bring forward immigrants that they mean are good immigrants because they have adapted to the national culture. So there is no like new Swedes in the sense that they can define Swedishness in their own terms. It's if they accept the Swedishness that has been decided by the Sweden Democrats, or in the Danish case, then the Danish People's Party version of Danishness. Then I think you could talk about an acceptance of new Swedes or new Danes, but not in a sense that it's something entirely new.
Well, this is so interesting, but we have gone over time, so I think it's time, to call it a day here. Do we have any last questions, Christopher, or anybody?
Just thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
In terms of what is truth in history, and what's the truth in archaeology, our ethical responsibilities and stuff like that. I hope that the past manipulated and things that makes you think about a lot. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been an interesting talk and many very interesting and thought-provoking questions, and I hope you have a nice weekend there at Orkney.
You.